Our first reading this Sunday is from the great prophet Daniel, and it's a prophecy about a time of deliverance, when the chosen people of Israel will be delivered from a time of tribulation by the angel, mediator, and protector of Israel named Michael. This is in reference to the angelic being we know as Saint Michael the Archangel. So if you wonder where this comes from, it comes all the way back from the Old Testament. The chosen people of Israel he is sent to deliver from the time of tribulation and from the time of suffering are those who are truly the people of God, which is to say, those who have remained faithful to him. We know that God is always faithful to us, but the question we always have to ask is, are we being faithful to him? And we know that the problem is that we're not always faithful to him. But this is really what our journey through life in many ways is all about. It's that journey to becoming truly faithful to God, who is always faithful to us. And God knows that we fall on this journey, and he gives us many aids in this journey, and one of those is the angels and the saints, especially the warrior prince of heaven, Saint Michael the Archangel. Now, Daniel goes on to say that when St. Michael arises, there's also going to be this time of great evil and tribulation on earth. And the idea here is that times of tribulation and evil are not simply the result of human beings doing bad things, but rather it's the result of fallen angels' activity in the world. There is a real spiritual reality behind all of the things that happen here on earth, whether good or evil. So what we see happening on earth are the visible ramifications, you might say, of the invisible spiritual battle that's going on all around us. Daniel prophesied that this time of tribulation will end with the resurrection from the dead, where some will enter into everlasting life, while others will enter into everlasting contempt. Now, this prophecy is important for us today because it serves as the background, you could say, for Jesus' prophecies in our gospel. What we have heard today from St. Mark's Gospel is a very short excerpt from a much longer discourse in his Gospel in the 13th chapter. And we're hearing from the middle of the end of this discourse. So we missed everything that led up to this discourse, and we're really missing the final sort of piece of the discourse as well. But in the prophecy, it shows Jesus speaking of two distinct yet interrelated events. He's speaking of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and he's also speaking of the end of the world. So while these two events are distinct, in the Jewish mindset, they would be inseparably linked together. This is because the temple in Jerusalem was created to be a sort of mini-universe. It was like a condensed image of the universe. So without getting into too much detail, there were elements in the temple which represented things like earth, sea, and the heavens. And it was done in this way to be representative of the universe as the universe was understood at that time. So if the temple were to be destroyed, it would have been symbolic of the destruction of the universe, the end of the world. So because of this connection, when the disciples earlier on in this passage, part of what we didn't read today, when they ask him about the destruction of the temple, Jesus goes from speaking about the destruction of the temple directly into speaking of the end of the world. It kind of flowed together in the Jewish mindset, in the Jewish worldview. So as Jesus speaks in the gospel today, he speaks about both events, the destruction of the temple and the overthrow of Jerusalem, as well as the end of the world. He begins with the sort of apocalyptic language which we heard in the book of Daniel today. Of course, apocalypse means revealing or pulling back the veil. So he begins by saying, in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of the earth to the end of the sky. So these words which Jesus is using is referencing many prophecies in the Old Testament. Prophecies of what it would look like when God would come himself and he would judge these different cities. You can think of the destruction of Babylon or the destruction of Egypt, for example. In those instances from the prophets, these images were used to show the spiritual significance behind a physical reality that was happening, the destruction of these cities because of their sinfulness. So Jesus uses these same words in the gospel to speak first about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And we know that this first part was about the destruction of the temple because he says that it would happen within this generation. This generation would not pass away before these things had taken place. And sure enough, about 40 years after Jesus prophesied this, the temple was indeed destroyed in Jerusalem in around 70 A.D. And there were these wars and persecutions by the Romans which resulted in the overthrow of the temple. But here's where the lectionary shifts and Jesus' words shift from speaking about the destruction of the temple to speaking about the end times. So at the very end of our gospel today, he says, "But of that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." And why the lectionary stops here, again, I don't know, because the thing that comes next is really the key to understanding what is going on. Because what happens next is Jesus compares this second day or hour with the parable of the master who goes away, leaves his servants in charge of his house, and then is going to come back at an unexpected hour when the servants don't know and are not prepared. So he's using two different images to speak of two different realities. The one of the fig tree and the one of the unexpected return of the master are two different times and hours. He's not speaking of the same thing here. The fig tree parable is in reference to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, to which he is exhorting his disciples to be aware, as there will be different signs and wonders which will accompany it, and they'll be able to understand, and will happen within this generation, the generation which he was speaking to. The second parable, which is not mentioned in our lectionary today, is of the unexpected hour of the end of the world, and it is not said that it will take place within one generation. So we are in that generation. We are in this generation which he is speaking of at the very end. We're not in the one referenced by the simile of the fig tree that has come and gone. We are now of the generations he references by the parable of the return of the master at the unknown hour. So the lesson for us is clear. We must be prepared. We must be prepared and ready and hopeful of the expectation of the return of our Lord. It's a great reminder for us as we are really on the cusp of entering into the holy season of Advent, this time of longing for the coming of the Lord. St. Ephraim said, "He, Jesus, wished to hide this from us so that we might remain on our guard and be aware that this might happen to us during our life. He said very clearly that he would come again, but without stating at what moment. Thus, through all generations and at all times, his coming is ardently awaited."